You're walking your dog on a quiet morning when a little girl glances back, and silently flashes a hand signal only trained rescuers would recognize. That moment changes everything. This is a story of instinct, scars, and a second chance at family. If stories like this move you, gently tap that like button, subscribe to our channel, and stay with us. What happens next will stay in your heart long after the screen fades. Mountain View, Colorado, was a place most people would call peaceful, where the mountains kept their watch like old friends, and the pines whispered in breezes that carried no urgency. On this late September afternoon, the sun sat low in a crisp blue sky, casting long golden fingers over quiet streets and porch steps painted in memory. The air held that dry edge just before autumn cracked into cold. And it was in this stillness that Cole Mathis walked, slow and deliberate, his cane tapping gently against the sidewalk beside his good knee. Cole was a man built from grit and silence. 45, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair kept military short, and a limp in his right leg that never quite healed from his final tour overseas. He wore a faded bomber jacket with an American flag stitched near the heart, and behind his steel-gray eyes lived the weight of things he never said. Most days, he kept to himself. He had tried living among noise after deployment, cities, towns with chatter and convenience, but it was too much. Mountain View offered what he needed: quiet, distance, and space to remember without being asked. Beside him trotted Shadow, his old German shepherd. Shadow was 8 now, larger than most, with a sable-black coat that shimmered under sunlight and deep amber eyes that missed nothing. The dog had served with Cole during a classified K-9 operation in northern Iraq, trained for explosive detection and silent pursuit. He, too, bore scars. A chunk of his left ear was gone, and a faint limp shadowed his back right paw. But he was alert, loyal, and moved like a soldier who never truly left the field. Civilians often mistook him for intimidating, but around Cole, he was a silent guardian, always watching, always reading the world. They were walking back from the vet center, where Cole had just finished another round of physical therapy. His knee ached in dull pulses, but he didn't complain, not even to Shadow. The path they took led past downtown's older quarter, where the red brick buildings leaned close together like neighbors whispering secrets. Here, the sidewalks were quieter, the air filled with the slow rustle of pine trees and flags hanging from modest porches. It was then, just near the old train bench where the cobblestones turned uneven, that Cole saw her. A woman, mid-50s, perhaps, crossed the sidewalk ahead, moving quickly. She was tall, thin, with wiry shoulders and a straight, no-nonsense posture. Her graying brown hair was tied back in a bun so tight it pulled at her temples, and she wore a beige wool coat buttoned all the way up despite the sun. One hand gripped a reusable grocery bag, the other clutched the wrist of a child. The girl couldn't have been more than 5. Light brown hair tangled over her cheeks, her face pale beneath the sunlight. She wore a too large purple hoodie, its sleeves bunched over her hands, and walked with short, hurried steps, struggling to match the woman's pace. Her eyes, gray and distant, glanced briefly at the sky, then swept the street. Cole wouldn't have noticed them more than any other pair of passers-by, except for what happened next. The girl looked over her shoulder. It was a flicker, a split second, but Cole's gaze locked with hers. And in that silent instant, something passed between them, not recognition, not fear, but a depth of stillness. Like the world held its breath. Then, without turning fully, the girl shifted her arm behind her back and raised 3 fingers, palm inward, quick and subtle. Cole stopped. Everything in him stilled, like the body remembered before the mind did. That gesture. That exact motion. It wasn't random. Behind him, Shadow let out a low growl, quiet, but pointed. His ears twitched forward. He had seen it too. Cole's breath caught. He glanced at the girl again, but she was already being pulled forward, vanishing behind a white picket fence that guarded a set of identical rental homes. No glance back. No hesitation. The 3-finger sign. He had last seen it taught in a Joint Task Force seminar in Syria, a universal silent plea for help, developed for civilians who couldn't speak openly. It wasn't used by children. Not unless they'd been taught. Not unless they were desperate. Cole didn't move for several seconds. His cane pressed into the sidewalk like a root anchoring him to the earth. Then he looked down at Shadow. The dog was facing the same direction, tail still, muscles tense. That wasn't nothing, Cole muttered. He pivoted, slowly at first. The pain in his knee flared, but he gritted through it. Shadow walked with him in perfect sync, each step a silent echo of urgency. They crossed the street without drawing attention. Cole's eyes scanned for the girl and the woman, but they were gone, somewhere inside one of the rental units beyond the fence line. The air had shifted. The birds were quiet. Even the wind had gone still, like the world had agreed to hold its noise for something more important. He stopped outside the fence and leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing on the row of houses. Identical builds, all gray-sided with navy trim. The doors were shut. No curtains moved. But something about one unit, number 14, made him pause. A shadow at the window. A shift behind the glass. Then nothing. Cole stepped back, pulling out his phone. He snapped a quick photo of the front of the unit, then turned and walked away without looking again. He didn't need to linger. Not yet. There were other ways to confirm what he felt deep in his chest. Back home, the small cabin sat nestled against a line of pines like it had been dropped there by accident and stayed out of loyalty. Shadow walked ahead, nudging the door open with his nose. Inside, it was modest, books stacked against the walls, a wood stove flickering in one corner, and a folded American flag in a shadow box above the mantel. Cole set his cane against the wall and dropped heavily into his worn chair. He didn't move for several minutes. Just sat, Shadow curled at his feet, both of them listening. Then he reached for the side drawer and pulled out a faded black folder. Labeled on the spine, Protocol, Civilian Rescue Indicators. He flipped to a dog-eared page and read the description. 3 fingers, palm in, behind the back. Distress signal. Use only when verbal communication is dangerous. Trained response, record, assess, observe, act with caution. He ran a hand over his face. She knows. Whoever taught her that, someone knew what they were doing. Shadow let out a soft whine, head resting near Cole's boot. I saw it, boy, Cole said softly. And you did too. Outside, the Colorado wind began to stir again, gentle, but with an edge that warned of colder days coming. But inside that house, across town, a girl had spoken the loudest without a word. And Cole Mathis, retired, broken in some ways, healing in others, was not the kind of man who could see that and walk away. Not anymore. The next morning came with a quiet unease. Mountain View had awoken to a fog that clung low over the streets like breath caught in prayer. The peaks of the Rockies were hidden behind a pale veil of gray mist, and even the usual songs of birds were subdued. Cole Mathis stood by the window of his small cabin, staring out with a mug of black coffee in hand, his fingers wrapped tightly around the ceramic. Shadow lay by the door, alert but still, his ears occasionally twitching with distant sounds. Neither man nor dog had slept well. Cole's mind replayed the image of the little girl, her gray eyes, the way her 3 fingers slipped behind her back like a whisper screamed into silence. He hadn't seen something like that since Fallujah, where children had learned to warn without words. The signal, the bruises beneath her sleeve, the fear etched into a glance, it wasn't a fluke. It was a cry. He set the mug down and reached for his old laptop, battered but functional. The plastic was worn at the corners, and one key was missing from years of fieldwork reports. He booted it up, fingers already moving with practiced familiarity. Years ago, when he'd still been stationed in the service, he'd used this very machine to write tactical briefings. Now, it was a tool for something more personal. He logged into a secured military liaison portal, one only accessible to retired personnel with clearance still intact. It took a few tries, the two-factor authentication was sluggish. But eventually, he pulled up the residential monitoring interface, a quiet little system used for background checks on transient military housing occupants. He typed in the address from the house he'd photographed the day before, 14, Meadow Lane. At first, there was nothing, just a generic record of temporary residency. Then a name appeared, Ruth Berryman, age 58, current resident since February, listed as a private caregiver. No dependents. No mention of a minor. Cole frowned. The system should have registered any child in the home, even temporarily. That was standard under housing law, especially near a military base. Something wasn't right. He dug deeper. Another window, another login, this one to the Federal Employment Registry. Ruth Berryman. Former child behavioral counselor. Suspended indefinitely from the Mountain View Youth Care Center 3 years ago. Reason, inappropriate psychological boundaries with multiple minors under care. No official charges. No trial. Just a suspension, and a quiet exit. Cole leaned back in his chair. The name had settled in his memory now. He remembered passing it once in a local newspaper, back when he first moved to town. There had been murmurs in the community, nothing concrete. People preferred forgetting what made them uncomfortable. Shadow, he muttered, as the dog lifted his head. Looks like she was hiding in plain sight. Shadow stood, trotting to the door without a sound. The unspoken language between them didn't need explaining, he was ready. The two returned to Meadow Lane late in the afternoon, the fog lifting just enough to let through a watery sun. Cole didn't approach the house directly. Instead, he walked Shadow around the perimeter, blending in with the residents walking their own dogs, exchanging polite nods with neighbors who barely noticed his presence. At first glance, number 14 looked like every other unit on the block, modest, clean, a hanging plant on the porch. But up close, it was different. The front door had no bell. The windows were double-paned with heavy fabric drapes drawn tight. The mailbox had no nameplate. Cole observed from across the street, standing by a lamppost that gave a clear view of the home. He knelt slowly beside Shadow, murmuring just above a whisper. "Track the scent, buddy." The girl. Shadow sniffed the air, then led Cole along the sidewalk, nose twitching. He stopped near the side yard, eyes fixated on a partially obscured window. There, behind the thick curtains, a soft imprint, just the shape of a small hand pressed to the glass, then gone. Cole narrowed his eyes. The scent was strongest there. Shadow let out a small huff, not a bark, but a sign, she was inside. Cole didn't linger. He needed more than instincts and shadows. That night, he visited someone who owed him a favor. Lieutenant Rachel Kim had served in the Military Police Corps and was now a local precinct officer in Mountain View. She was in her late 30s, lean, quick-moving, and sharp-eyed. Her mixed Korean and Mexican heritage gave her a striking look, jet-black hair tied in a high ponytail, and a gaze that sliced through lies like a blade. Rachel had grown up in a household with a narcissistic father who taught her early to spot manipulation. It was why she chose law enforcement, and why she never let her guard down. When Cole arrived at the small police substation tucked behind the library, Rachel met him in the break room, sipping coffee from a chipped Wonder Woman mug. "Let me guess," she said, before he even Saturday, "you saw something weird again." Cole gave a half-smile. "This one's different." He laid out the photo of Ruth's house, the printed record from the military database, and a snapshot of the girl's three-finger signal drawn crudely by hand. Rachel studied the files with growing concern. "No kid registered?" she asked. "None," Cole replied. "No birth certificate, no foster record, no school, no doctor, nothing." Rachel sighed. "You know, without direct harm or missing persons notice, I can't do much. But," she pushed the photos back toward him, "I can quietly ping a few state systems. See if she's connected to any past investigations." And if she isn't? Then we wait. Or we dig deeper. Cole nodded. I'll handle that part. He left the station with Rachel's unspoken permission to keep watching. It was the closest thing to a green light he'd get. Back at home, Shadow curled up by the fireplace. Cole sat in the dim light, reviewing everything again. The house. The lack of records. The scent Shadow had found. The woman with a name that no longer matched her role. And most of all, the girl. The one with storm-gray eyes and a signal burned into his memory. He didn't know her name yet. But he knew she was trying to survive. And now she wasn't alone. The autumn air had turned crisper by the third morning, carrying with it the subtle scent of dried leaves and chimney smoke. Cole Mathis leaned against the wooden railing of his back porch, the collar of his jacket flipped up against the early chill. His eyes were focused not on the trees turning gold, but on the camera in his hands, a small, high-resolution model once issued for covert recon, now repurposed for a quieter kind of surveillance. Shadow sat beside him, alert as always, his gaze steady and unwavering, following Cole's line of sight like a mirrored instinct. For hours the day before, Cole had watched from across Meadow Lane, camouflaged by the fading branches of an old maple tree. He'd positioned himself on a slight slope behind a neighbor's broken fence, giving him a direct line to number 14 without drawing attention. Ruth Berryman hadn't emerged until mid-afternoon. The moment she stepped outside, dragging the little girl behind her, Cole's finger hovered over the shutter button. The girl, Lila, wore a faded pink sweatshirt too thin for the weather, its sleeves pulled down over her small hands. Her posture was hunched, almost protective. She didn't speak. Didn't smile. And as she stepped onto the porch behind Ruth, she flinched slightly when the woman snapped something impatiently in her direction. Cole couldn't hear the words, but the tone was enough. The child was afraid. He zoomed in on her left arm as Ruth adjusted the strap on Lila's backpack. That's when he saw it, a flash of discolored skin beneath the fabric. A dark bruise, just above the wrist. Cole's breath tightened. He clicked the shutter 3 times. Shadow growled softly. Now, reviewing the still frames back home, Cole saw it even clearer, the bruises, the unnatural way Lila held herself, the lack of life in her eyes. It was all there, frozen in a sequence of silence. He packed the photos in a manila folder, marked with only one word, Lila. Rachel Kim opened the door to her small home office that evening wearing joggers and an old academy hoodie, her hair wet from a recent shower. She blinked when she saw Cole holding the folder. "This can't wait until morning?" she asked, stepping aside. "It shouldn't," Cole replied simply. Rachel's office was tidy, functional, filled with certificates, files, and an old photo of her academy graduation, where she stood with 2 younger brothers who now lived in Florida. Her home smelled faintly of jasmine tea and the lemon polish she used religiously, tidiness being one of the few things she could still control after a career of chaos. She sat across from him, flipping through the photographs. Her expression changed with each one, shifting from curiosity to concern, and finally, to that still, hard focus of a cop weighing what she could and couldn't do under the law. "I can't act on bruises alone," she said after a long pause. "It's not that I don't believe you, Cole. But this town's been burned by false alarms. And Ruth's past, while disturbing, isn't enough for a warrant. We'd need direct evidence of abuse or neglect, preferably something on record. School reports. Medical visits. Testimonies. She's not registered anywhere," Cole said. "She's a ghost." Rachel closed the folder. "Then make her real." The next morning, Cole and Shadow returned to Meadow Lane, this time keeping a lower profile. They took position behind the hedge that separated the lane from the neighboring park. From this vantage point, they could watch the path leading from Ruth's house to the playground across the street. By late morning, Ruth appeared again. Her gait was stiff, shoulders squared as though daring anyone to look too long. She wore the same coat, a pair of tan slacks, and thick-soled orthopedic shoes. With one hand she held a tote bag full of crackers and juice boxes. The other hand clamped around Lila's arm. Lila shuffled behind her, silent, gaze lowered, her thin legs barely keeping up. When they reached the bench near the swings, Ruth sat and pulled out a paperback novel, acting as if she were any ordinary caregiver. She didn't even glance at the jungle gym or the other kids. She simply sat, reading, while Lila remained standing. The girl didn't play. Didn't wander. She just stood beside the bench like a shadow of herself. A few yards away, a young mother named Clara watched with faint curiosity. Clara was in her late 20s, petite with a short auburn bob and freckles dusting her nose. She was usually outgoing, friendly with other parents at the playground. Today, she hesitated. Her toddler was playing in the mulch, but her gaze kept drifting to the silent girl in pink. Clara had seen them before, Ruth and Lila, but never heard the woman speak kindly, never saw the child laugh. It wasn't her place to interfere, she thought, but something about the stillness in Lila's body unsettled her. She made a mental note to mention it to her sister, who worked at the local community center. Cole remained in the background, dressed like a man out for a stroll with his dog, but never once taking his eyes off the girl. Shadow sat close to his leg, tail unmoving. At one point, Ruth got up to throw away a wrapper, leaving Lila momentarily alone on the bench. Cole took a slow step forward, careful not to startle. Lila looked up. Their eyes met again. He gave the faintest of nods, not to alarm her, not to call attention, just a silent recognition. Then she did something he didn't expect. She reached up and scratched her sleeve back, just slightly. Enough for him to see the bruise again, and the skin around it, yellowing, old. It had been there for days. Cole nodded once more. Ruth returned. Lila dropped her arm. Later that night, Cole made his notes. He mapped the girls' pattern, what time they left, how long they stayed, where Ruth kept her distance. He noted the changes in Lila's posture when Ruth wasn't looking, the signals, the quiet ones. The ones only someone trained would see. He was building a case, even if the system wasn't ready to accept it yet. Saturday arrived with a fragile kind of sunlight, the sort that filters through high clouds but never quite warms the skin. In Mountain View, the leaves had begun to fall in earnest, painting the sidewalks in copper and gold. Cole Mathis stood near the community park's fence, a discreet figure blending into the rhythms of the weekend morning. He wore his dark flannel jacket and a faded baseball cap pulled low, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharply focused. Shadow, his German shepherd, sat obediently at his side, leash slack, head tilted as he scanned the passing movement of children, parents, and the rare jogger. The park was alive with chatter and squeals of laughter, except at one bench near the swing set, where silence lived like an unwelcome guest. There sat Ruth Berryman, spine straight, feet flat on the ground, her hands folded atop a leather handbag. Her clothing was as rigid as her demeanor, a gray wool coat with a high collar, black trousers, and polished shoes that gleamed unnecessarily for a day at the park. Her gray-streaked bun was wound so tightly that it seemed to stretch her skin taut across her temples. She held a paperback but didn't read it, her gaze wandered in narrow circles, always returning to the small girl sitting beside her. Lila. The child wore a too large navy hoodie with the sleeve stretched halfway over her hands. Her posture was closed, knees pulled close, shoulders hunched, chin low. She didn't look around or fidget like other children her age. She sat still as a statue, staring at nothing, as if frozen in place by rules she couldn't speak aloud. Her shoes were mismatched, one slightly newer than the other, and her hair, though brushed, had a dullness that no shampoo could disguise. Cole observed from behind the fence, leaning against the wooden railing with casual intent. In his hand, he held a small packet of chocolate-covered peanuts. The brand was common enough, bright red packaging, harmless on the surface. But to Lila, if she truly was who he thought she was, this candy might be more than a treat. It could be a key. He had learned from his late-night call with a woman named April Jameson, mother of a missing girl from Texas, that her daughter, Ellie, had a severe peanut allergy. Even the smell, she'd said, made the child's lips swell and her eyes redden. She had told him, with a voice trembling through tears, if that's really her, she'll react the moment she gets near it. She can't fake that. No child can. This morning was a test, not of allergy, but of truth. Cole gave a low whistle. Shadow stood. They moved toward the bench at a steady pace. Cole walked like a man enjoying the autumn air, carrying a sports drink in one hand and the candy in the other. As he neared the swing set, he made sure not to approach directly, just enough to be noticed. "Morning," he called out casually. Ruth turned her head, her eyes narrowing just slightly. Cole nodded toward the girl beside her. "I think I saw your daughter here the other day." Beautiful eyes. Ruth's lips curled into a rehearsed smile. "Yes, we often come here. And this must be Lila," she answered quickly, too quickly. "She's shy." Cole crouched slightly to level himself with the girl's eye line. "Hey there, Lila. I've got too much of this candy, thought I'd share." He tilted the open packet toward her, exposing the shiny shell of the chocolate peanuts. The reaction wasn't theatrical. Lila didn't scream. She didn't cry. But her eyes widened, her pupils dilated, and she drew back, not in fear of a stranger, but in alarm at what she saw. Her small hands clutched at the collar of her hoodie, pulling it closer to her face. It was instinctual. Primal. Shadow moved forward at that precise moment and pressed his nose gently to her hand. Lila didn't pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes for just a second and exhaled, the faintest tremor passing through her shoulders. A wordless moment passed between girl and dog, the kind that couldn't be staged or taught. Ruth stood abruptly. "She doesn't eat food from strangers," she said, voice tight. "She has a sensitive stomach." Cole raised his palms in mock surrender. "Fair enough. Just thought I'd offer." Shadow didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on Lila. She opened her eyes again, and for the first time since their encounter began, she looked directly at Cole. Her gaze wasn't fearful now, it was searching. Ruth took Lila's hand. "We were just leaving." Cole nodded slowly, watching as they turned toward the sidewalk. Shadow didn't follow, but his tail gave a single thump as Lila glanced over her shoulder one last time. There was something behind her eyes now, not just fear, but recognition. Later that evening, Cole returned home and made notes. The test had been subtle, but effective. Lila's response had been genuine, there was no doubt about that. He recorded everything in his file, the exact brand of candy used, the timing of her reaction, the positioning of Shadow, Ruth's interruption, and the girl's instinctive withdrawal. He also noted something he hadn't expected, Shadow's behavior. The dog had never met Lila before, yet he had moved toward her with a calm certainty, pressing his head gently to her hand as if he'd done it 100 times. Cole poured himself a whiskey, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the photograph of Ellie Jameson taped to the wall. It was from a missing persons bulletin, taken at age 3. Smiling, holding a stuffed cat, with wild curls framing her cheeks. It had been 2 years since that photo was taken. And today, for the first time, Cole felt certain he had seen her again. Not in a picture. Not in theory. In person. The next morning arrived cloaked in stillness. Mountain View was caught between seasons, one foot in autumn's golden hush, the other inching toward winter's gray edge. Frost kissed the corners of windshields and rooftop shingles, melting slow under the pale breath of the sun. Cole Mathis stood by his kitchen window, mug in hand, watching the cold crawl across the yard like fog searching for purpose. He hadn't slept much. His mind replayed the moment Lila had pulled back from the candy, her wide eyes brimming with the kind of fear a child didn't learn, it had to be lived. The connection with Shadow had been undeniable, almost primal. Cole had seen war, seen what trauma did to the faces of the young, and he'd seen healing, too, though it always arrived slowly, one thread at a time. But this girl, whoever she was, didn't have the luxury of time. Shadow sat near the back door, tail thudding once as Cole glanced at him. "I think it's time," Cole muttered. "Time to see if we can find her real name." They didn't head to the park that day. Instead, they took the long way, looping around the backside of the residential block, past the old middle school now repurposed into a public community center. Cole had been there once, briefly, for a Veterans Day breakfast 2 years ago. Today, the building was closed, but the playground beside it remained accessible. That's when he saw it. Along the short retaining wall of the school's outer yard, chalk drawings. Dozens of them, faded from last week's rain but still visible in pastel ghosts. Unicorns, suns with smiles, lopsided houses. But at the far corner, near the edge of a neglected sandbox, one image stood apart. Cole stopped. It was a large dog, square body, pointed ears, drawn in smudged gray and black chalk. Beside it, a small girl holding the leash, with a single word scribbled in a shaky hand above the pair, Shadow. Cole knelt. The letters were uneven, the lines careful like someone afraid to make a mistake. There was a small heart drawn between the figures. And beside the girl's feet, 3 short vertical dashes. Not a name, not a game. A signal. He took a photo with his phone, his hand trembling just slightly. Someone approached behind him. "Cool drawing," said a young voice. Cole turned. A boy, no older than 8, stood with a scooter leaned against his hip. He had bright red sneakers and a mop of curly blonde hair barely tamed under a Spider-Man beanie. His name, embroidered on his backpack, read Tanner. Cole offered a calm smile. "Do you know who drew this one?" The boy nodded. "The quiet girl. The one with the serious lady. She comes sometimes, but never plays. Just draws. One time she gave me a crayon, 'cause I dropped mine." "What's her name?" Cole asked, careful not to sound too eager. Tanner shrugged. "Don't know. She doesn't talk much. But one day I heard her mumble something. I think she said, Ellie." Cole's pulse kicked. "Thanks, kid," he said, standing. "No problem," Tanner grinned. "Shadow's a cool name for a dog." That night, back home, Cole pulled out his notes again. The name matched. April Jameson's missing daughter, Ellie, gone without a trace from a park in Denton, Texas 2 years ago. The file said she loved to draw dogs. She had a stuffed German Shepherd toy when she was little. He opened his laptop and logged into a private forum for missing persons coordinators and retired field agents. It was a tight-knit network, one he hadn't used in years. Cole posted the photo of the chalk drawing with the message. Seeking ID confirmation. Possible visual link to missing child, Ellie Jameson, DOB February 13. Please forward to parent or legal guardian for validation. The response came faster than expected. A user named AJTexas_1978 replied within the hour. "This is April Jameson. That's her handwriting. That's my daughter. Where is she?" Cole stared at the screen, the gravity of the moment landing like cold rain. He sent a private message. "No details. Just. She's alive. But not safe. I need to confirm more before you come. Give me 48 hours. Elsewhere in town, Ruth Berryman walked her usual route toward the corner pharmacy, Lila trailing behind like a reluctant shadow. Ruth's steps were clipped, her heels striking pavement in a rhythm too sharp for the calm morning. She wore a long burgundy coat and oversized sunglasses that concealed half her face, despite the weak sun. Inside the pharmacy, the clerk, a kind woman named Sandra, mid-50s, with soft curls and a cardigan speckled with cat hair, greeted her politely. "Morning, Ruth." Ruth didn't smile. "Just picking up vitamins. For my daughter." Sandra glanced at Lila, who stood stiffly behind a display of greeting cards. "She's quiet today," Sandra remarked. "She's always quiet," Ruth replied curtly. "Some children are sensitive." Sandra didn't argue. But after Ruth left, she jotted a note on the back of a receipt and slipped it into her drawer. It read, "Girl looks pale. Never smiles. Something feels off. Watch next time." Later that afternoon, Cole stood outside the community library, waiting. The library wasn't busy on Sundays, especially not during football season. Only 2 cars sat in the lot. Cole wasn't here for books. He was meeting someone. A tall woman in a faded army jacket walked up the path. Her short dreadlocks were streaked with silver, and a scar traced the side of her left jaw like a question mark. Her name was Marla Dent, a former military intelligence analyst who now worked cyber investigation from home. Cole had called in a favor. Marla didn't waste time. "I ran Ruth Berryman through 5 state databases," she said. "Nothing connects her to any legal guardianship of a child in the last 10 years. In fact," she handed him a printout. "In 2017, she was flagged for suspicion at a community daycare in El Paso. Psychological manipulation. Charges dismissed for lack of evidence." Cole flipped the page. A photo. It showed Ruth, younger, smiling, and next to her, Ellie. 3 years old. Holding a chalk drawing of a dog. Cole's jaw clenched. "This wasn't random," he muttered. "No," Marla agreed. "She knew the girl. Probably planned this." Back at home that night, Cole stared at the fire in his stove. Shadow lay curled near his feet, one ear twitching, eyes half-lidded but never fully asleep. Cole opened the drawer where he kept the files and placed the new evidence beside them. They were building something now. Not just suspicion. But truth. The sky that morning in Mountain View was a perfect blue, clear but distant, as if it held its breath for something that hadn't yet happened. Sunlight filtered through the last of the golden leaves, their edges curled and trembling in the soft breeze. At the park near Ridge Hollow, benches remained cold from the early frost, but the air had that strange kind of warmth that came not from temperature, but from light itself. Cole Mathis arrived early. He wore his dark olive coat, the one with the reinforced stitching at the shoulders, and kept Shadow close on a loose leash. Shadow was unusually quiet today, no sniffs, no tail sways, just focused, ears forward, body steady. They settled on a bench far enough to not be seen as obvious, yet close enough to act quickly if anything went wrong. Cole's eyes scanned the path, the swings, the sandbox where Lila sometimes stood without playing. He checked the time on his old military-issued watch, 9:42 a.m. At 9:45, the beige sedan rolled into the park's edge, engine purring low before fading into silence. April Jameson stepped out slowly. She was in her early 40s, medium height, with long, ash-blonde hair tied in a low ponytail. She wore a navy peacoat over jeans and a gray scarf looped loosely around her neck. Her face, once probably warm and radiant, was tired, worn not by age but by waiting. Her eyes held the kind of dull ache only a mother could carry, the ache of 2 years without knowing if your child was alive. April had driven through the night, heart pounding with each highway mile, guided only by a photo, a chalk drawing, and the hope planted by Cole's simple message, "I think it's her." She sat on a bench on the opposite side of the park, still, hands clasped in her lap. Her eyes scanned the space as if trying not to hope too much, trying to brace for disappointment once again. Cole didn't wave. Didn't nod. He simply turned his head slightly. Shadow remained still. At 9:52, Ruth Berryman arrived. She wore a brown wool dress coat and black gloves despite the moderate weather. Her lips were painted in a muted shade of rose, and her hair was pulled into a bun as tight as ever. Lila walked 3 steps behind her, silent as always. Her hoodie today was forest green, sleeves too long again, and her jeans had a small tear at the knee. Ruth sat at her usual bench and pulled out a puzzle book. She didn't look at Lila, didn't speak to her. Just flipped to a half-completed crossword and pretended to be ordinary. Lila stood at the corner of the sandbox. Cole observed the girl carefully. She didn't move toward the playground equipment. Didn't glance at the swings. She just stood, staring at the dirt as though waiting for permission to breathe. Then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, Shadow stood. He didn't bark. Didn't tug. He simply walked forward, one slow step at a time, across the grass and toward Lila. His movements were calm, gentle, reverent. Cole didn't stop him. Lila looked up at the sound of the footsteps. Her eyes widened. She froze, then blinked once, twice, as if trying to determine whether what she saw was real. Shadow reached her and sat beside her small figure, his body angled protectively. Slowly, carefully, she reached out her hand and touched the side of his face. Her fingers trembled. Then her lips moved. "Buddy," she whispered, barely audible. Cole's heart dropped. That had been Shadow's call name during service. Only 3 people had ever known it, his handler, his partner, and the little girl who once clung to his collar during a storm in Texas. Ellie. From across the park, April inhaled sharply. She stood, feet unsteady, and began walking slowly, each step as if made through molasses. Cole didn't move. He let the scene unfold. Lila turned her head and saw April. She stared for a long moment, not moving, not blinking. Her hand still rested on Shadow's fur. April reached them in slow, reverent silence. She knelt down a few feet away, tears already brimming. "Ellie," she said softly. The girl's lip quivered. She didn't run. Not yet. Her body held stillness like a question. Her eyes flicked from April to Shadow, then back. April opened her arms. "My baby," she whispered. "It's okay. I'm here. I never stopped looking." Lila's breath caught. Her shoulders shook. And then she moved. Not fast, not wild, just forward. She stepped into her mother's arms and let out a strangled sound that began as a whimper and turned into a sob. April wrapped her arms around her, pulling the girl so close it looked as if she were trying to fold her back into her own heartbeat. Shadow sat beside them, silent sentinel. Cole remained behind, allowing the moment to unfold. Ruth was still on her bench. Her face was turned toward them now, her expression unreadable. But her eyes, sharp, calculating, watched everything. She stood, slowly. Cole met her halfway. "I know who you are," he said, low but firm. Ruth didn't respond. She adjusted her gloves. "That child isn't yours," Cole continued. "And it ends today." She gave a small, polite smile, the kind you'd wear at a funeral. "I've given her a good life." "No," Cole said. "You gave her a shadow of a life." Ruth opened her mouth to speak, but something behind her shifted. April stood, holding Ellie close. The girl was trembling, face buried in her mother's coat. Ruth's mouth closed. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was tight. Electric. Then Ruth turned and walked away. Cole didn't stop her, not yet. But this time, the world had seen what needed to be seen. That night, April stayed at a small roadside inn just outside of town. Cole arranged it quietly, not wanting Ruth to know where she was. Shadow curled at Ellie's feet in the hotel room, and the girl fell asleep with one hand clutching the dog's collar. Cole stood by the hallway window, watching the rain begin to fall outside. Ellie had spoken. She had said the word. Mom. And no storm in the world could erase that. The next morning in Mountain View carried the weight of something about to snap. Clouds hung low and thick over the rooftops, pressing down with a grayness that felt almost deliberate. The air was cold and still, too quiet for a town that usually stirred with weekend life. Cole Mathis sensed it even before his phone buzzed. The message came from Rachel Kim. Just 2 words. She knows. Cole was already halfway into his boots. Shadow, as if reading the urgency in his movements, stood and stretched, his ears perked and body already alert. They moved fast. Across town, Ruth Berryman was packing. She moved through her modest home like a woman possessed, sharp, efficient, unblinking. Her mouth was tight, eyes hard. She had pulled out 2 suitcases from the back of her closet, stuffing clothes with mechanical precision. On the table sat a forged birth certificate under the name Lila Mae Berryman and a set of travel tickets, one way, heading east. She had done this before. Disappearing wasn't new to her. Reinvention had been a habit long before Ellie came into her life. Ruth wasn't tall, but her presence always felt imposing. Years of manipulating systems, dodging scrutiny, and warping truth had given her the steel of someone who believed they were always one step ahead. But her nerves were fraying now. The way April had appeared in that park. The way the girl, Ellie, had run to her. The way Cole had looked at her, not like a stranger, but a hunter. She had seen that expression once before, decades ago, in a courtroom hallway she had walked free from while others watched in disbelief. She wasn't going to wait for the system this time. Ellie sat silently at the kitchen table, her face pale and her body unmoving. She wore a red sweatshirt and jeans. Her hair was tangled, and her hands were folded tightly in her lap. Ruth paused in the doorway, eyes narrowed. "Up," she said. "We're leaving." Ellie didn't move. "Now, Ellie." The child blinked but didn't speak. Instead, she slowly slid from the chair, her shoulders stiff. She didn't ask where they were going. She knew better than to ask. Ruth guided her down the hallway toward the small coat closet near the back of the house. She opened the door, revealing the dark narrow space inside. "Just wait here," she said, her voice clipped. "It's only for a little while." Ellie hesitated. Ruth's hand closed around her arm, not hard, but tight enough to end the hesitation. She pushed the girl inside and shut the door, sliding the latch. Then she turned and walked toward the garage, keys already in her hand. Cole and Shadow reached Meadow Lane within 10 minutes. They approached from the alley behind the house, where a loose board in the fence had been marked by Cole days ago. As they moved through the shadows, Cole's phone buzzed again. Rachel had dispatched a patrol car, but it would take time. Not enough time. "Let's move," Cole whispered. Shadow led the way. His body was low, steps precise, nose close to the ground. He paused near the side window, then moved toward the back door. Cole tested the handle. Locked. But the older lock was weak. He reached into his coat, pulled out a thin pry tool, and worked in silence. In 20 seconds, the door gave way with a soft click. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet. Shadow stepped in first, scanning the kitchen, then the hall. Cole followed, his footsteps ghosting across the tile. He knew how to move without sound, how to read rooms like terrain. A sweater lay discarded on the floor. A glass sat half full on the counter. Everything looked rushed. He reached the hallway, his eyes flicking from door to door. Then he heard it. A faint thump. Like a small body shifting. Shadow growled low, then padded to the coat closet and sat. Cole knelt. "Ellie," he whispered. No answer. But a small whimper escaped through the wood. He unlatched the lock and opened the door. Ellie stood inside, her face tear-streaked, her hands gripping the edges of her sleeves. When she saw Shadow, she let out a small gasp, not fear, but recognition, and stepped forward, falling into the dog's side, burying her face in his fur. Cole touched her shoulder gently. "It's okay. You're safe now." He scooped her into his arms. She didn't resist. They exited through the back just as Ruth pulled the garage door open. She didn't see them at first. She was checking her rearview mirror, eyes darting, breath shallow. Then she looked up, and froze. Cole stepped into her line of sight, Ellie in his arms, Shadow beside him. "It's over," he said simply. Ruth's jaw trembled. Her hand hovered near the car door handle. Before she could speak, another voice called out. "Drop your keys, Ruth." Rachel Kim approached from the side, her service weapon holstered but her badge visible. She wore jeans and a sheriff's windbreaker, her face hard as steel. Ruth hesitated. Rachel took another step. "Now." The keys fell to the ground. Rachel walked over and handcuffed her without ceremony. Ruth didn't scream. Didn't cry. She just stared at Ellie as if something inside her had cracked in half. "You don't understand," she whispered. Rachel didn't respond. At the station, Ruth was processed on charges of child abduction, falsification of documents, and unlawful confinement. Her previous psychological evaluations were reopened. Investigators from Texas were notified. Within hours, the system that had failed to find Ellie 2 years ago finally began to recognize her again. That night, in the quiet of April's motel room, Cole watched as Ellie fell asleep curled next to Shadow. April sat beside them, gently brushing her daughter's hair back from her face, tears still slipping down her cheeks. "You found her," she said softly. "You saved her." Cole shook his head. "She found the strength to ask for help. I just listened." April looked at him. "No one else did." Cole said nothing. Shadow lifted his head, let out a soft exhale, then closed his eyes again. Outside, rain began to fall. But inside, the child was safe. The warm Texas sun welcomed them home like an old friend. The air was dry, carrying the faint scent of cedar and red clay. A few wildflowers still clung to the edges of the road as April's truck rolled up the familiar driveway, small, cracked, and bordered with tufts of grass that hadn't been trimmed in weeks. But none of that mattered. Ellie was home. She sat in the back seat, her hands tucked around a soft blanket that Shadow had used during the long drive. Her hair, now brushed and tied with a simple blue ribbon, framed a face that had begun to soften. The constant shadow of fear that once darkened her eyes had faded just a little. Not gone, but less consuming. A quiet glow had replaced it, the first embers of safety. April stepped out of the truck and opened the door for her daughter. She didn't rush her. Ellie climbed down slowly, looking around as if seeing her home for the very first time. The porch still squeaked when stepped on. The old rocking chair leaned slightly to the left. A wind chime tinkled gently under the awning. It was all the same. And yet, everything had changed. Inside, April had dusted and aired out the rooms before they returned, but the house still carried the scent of absence, something she now hoped to fill again. Ellie's room was exactly as she had left it, pale lavender walls, a small bookshelf with animal stories, a faded rug with a crescent moon in the center. But now, resting on her bed, was a new addition, a framed photo of Shadow sitting next to Eli, both of them looking toward the camera with quiet strength. Ellie walked over and picked it up, her fingers brushing the glass. That night, after a quiet dinner of macaroni and peas, Ellie's favorite, April unpacked a small wooden box filled with art supplies. Old crayons, a watercolor set, and a few sharpened pencils. She placed them on the kitchen table and stepped back. "You don't have to," April said gently. "Only if you want to." Ellie hesitated. Then she climbed into the chair, pulled the paper toward her, and began to draw. She didn't speak. But April could hear everything through the sound of pencil against paper. The lines were tentative at first. Then more certain. A house. A woman with long brown hair. A big dog with upright ears. And a man, broad-shouldered, with a beard and a camouflage jacket. When she finished, she colored the background in soft hues of orange and gold. The next morning, April found the drawing taped to the refrigerator with a magnet that read "You are loved." On the bottom corner, written in careful print, was a sentence. "Uncle Eli and Shadow saw me when nobody else did." Back in Mountain View, Cole Mathis sat in his garage-turned office, sipping weak coffee from a chipped mug. Shadow lay nearby, tail flicking every so often, eyes half closed. The two had settled back into their quiet rhythm, but something lingered, an ache that wasn't quite sorrow and not quite peace. The mail arrived mid-morning, and with it came a thick envelope postmarked from Texas. Inside was a folded letter and a single drawing. The letter was written in two hands, April's cursive and Ellie's simple, blocky print. It told him of Ellie's adjustment, how she had nightmares still, but fewer, how she no longer flinched at sudden sounds, how she asked to sleep with the drawing of Shadow on her nightstand. April had written. "You gave her back to me. And you didn't just return a daughter, you gave her the voice to call me Mom again." Beneath that, in Ellie's handwriting. "I hope Shadow gets peanut butter treats every day. Tell him I miss his soft ears." Cole smiled, eyes misting despite himself. He stood and walked to the wall above his workbench, a space once reserved for military memorabilia and a single shelf of books. There, between a folded American flag and a photograph of his old unit, he pinned Ellie's drawing with care. It joined the other images of Shadow, one from their early days in the field, one with the K-9 unit, and one from their first walk in Mountain View, when neither of them knew that healing would come in the form of a silent signal on a quiet street. Cole stepped back, arms crossed, gaze lingering on the trio in the picture, the little girl, the soldier, and the dog. "We did good, partner," he said softly. Shadow gave a small grunt and stretched, then padded over to lean against his leg. On Sunday, Cole visited Rachel Kim for dinner, something they had done every few months, but lately, it had become more frequent. Rachel lived in a small two-story house on the edge of town, filled with mismatched furniture, a grumpy orange cat named Beans, and the smell of rosemary chicken. "You look lighter," she said as they sat down to eat. Cole chuckled. "Think that's just your cooking?" "No," she said, watching him. "It's her, isn't it? Ellie." Cole nodded. "She's back home. Drawing again." Rachel smiled. "That's a win." Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and Beans had grudgingly climbed into Cole's lap, Rachel asked, "You ever think about teaching? Or mentoring?" Cole shook his head. "I wouldn't know where to start." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "You already did." Weeks passed. The air grew warmer. Spring began to press into the soil of both Mountain View and a small Texas town, where April watched her daughter play outside with neighborhood kids for the first time in nearly 2 years. Ellie didn't talk much, but her laughter, light and breathy, returned in bursts. She would come home with grass stains on her jeans, dirt under her fingernails, and sun on her cheeks. And each night, before bed, she placed the drawing of Uncle Eli and Shadow on the nightstand beside her. Not out of fear, but remembrance. Some things, after all, are not meant to be forgotten. In the end, it wasn't just about saving a child, it was about seeing what others chose to ignore. Sometimes, the quietest signals are the loudest cries for help. In our everyday lives, how often do we pass by someone silently struggling, too busy or afraid to look closer? If this story made you feel something, share it with someone who needs a reminder to see. Like, comment, and subscribe to join us for more true stories that matter. And tell us in the comments, what's one moment in your life when you noticed something others missed?